Hi, today we'll be covering lesson 3, which focuses on the stage 1 for the improvement size methodology, which is project phase. So as you can recall from our previous lesson, the improvement size methodology for this course is actually adapted from our review of 3 main QI methodologies within healthcare. The first one is the Institute for Healthcare Improvement model. The second one is the New South Wales Healthcare Clinical Practice Improvement model. And the last one is actually the National Healthcare Trust in Scotland Practice Development Framework. So we actually incorporate all these 3 models to actually guide you and present you a framework to guide you through how you're going to develop your clinical project. So this slide shows you the improvement size methodology, which is comprised of 5 phases. The first phase is actually a project phase. This phase requires you to determine what you're trying to accomplish and discuss the plan about who should be involved and how much resources are needed. Okay, so that will be the focus for today's lesson. So this is the objectives for today's lesson. I'll be bringing you through 6 steps about how to develop your own project proposal, also known as a project charter. So this is the first step. We will be taking a look at how to develop a project charter. So what is a project charter all about? It's actually also known as a project plan or proposal if you are more familiar with the term. It is the most important document for any project because it establishes the project outlines, guidelines for the stakeholders as well as the team players. It is a formal document that authorizes you to execute your projects, provide you with the resources needed for the project, as well as appoint manpower to support you so that you can complete the project. Now, the first part of the project proposal or charter is the case or the background section. You need to provide this at the start of the project proposal, which includes the background of the project, the context of the problem, what's the reason why you are doing this project, as well as a summary of your project information. So these details should be brief, but yet succinct. So you average about 1 to 3 paragraphs in most cases. Now, the next thing you want to provide is the problem statement. A problem can be defined as the gap between the existing state and the desired state of the so-called change process. So you need to provide a statement in a few sentences, usually about 2 to 3 sentences, that identifies and summarizes what is the problem you are trying to address here. So it's typically included in the project charter to actually provide the quality improvement team with the so-called idea about what they are trying to achieve. So how do we write a good problem statement? These are some points that you can consider when writing your problem statements. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a video about what is considered a good problem statement. So let's have a look.
In the last lecture, we learned the characteristics that will be considered while creating a problem statement. Now let's look into the example of a strong problem statement. The problem statement says, in the first quarter, the California Distribution Center sent 108,000 packages. Of those packages, 15,000 were returned, resulting in a 13.8% return rate. The rate of return is above the accepted 7% rate and cost the company an additional $372,000 for the quarter. Over the course of the year, the current process could result in additional costs of over $1.4 million. This problem statement covers all the basic information. Information number 1, when? The answer is, during the first quarter of this year. Information number 2, where? The answer is, the California Distribution Center. Information number 3, what? The answer is, returns. Information number 4, how many? The answer is, 15,000, or 6.8% above expectations. Information number 5. What is the magnitude? The answer is, the cost could be $1.4 million a year. The problem statement doesn't talk about solutions or provide too many details. This is a strong problem statement because it answers all the basic questions and it provides a significant reason for leadership to invest interest. $1.4 million a year is a big loss.
Now, I hope the video has helped you understand a bit more about how to draft out a good problem statement. So this is a visual example about how you're going to start drafting out your problem statement. Now, the next component you want to include in your proposal or plan is actually the project objectives. You should draft it and make it tangible, concise, realistic, and specific to what you want to achieve. So a good way to draft a project proposal is probably to use the SMART criteria. Now, this slide shows you the checklist to assess whether your objective adhere to the SMART criteria. So have a look at it and make sure that when you draft it, it adheres to the SMART criteria. Now, these slides will show you how a SMART goal will look very differently from a non-SMART goal. Now, the next component you need in the project proposal is the project scope, which is a statement that defines the boundaries of the project based on the needs, expected outcomes, available resources, and constraints. It allows the key stakeholder to have a better understanding of a project, about what it's trying to do, and as well as what it is not trying to do. So I will show you a video to explain about this.
Don't bite off more than you can chew. An essential step in project planning is defining the project scope. Project scope involves determining and documenting a list of specific project goals, deliverables, tasks, costs, and deadlines to inform stakeholders, but also keep the team focused and on task. The documentation is called a scope statement, which establishes project boundaries, responsibilities for each team member, and procedures for how work will be approved. A scope statement articulates what the project entails so that all stakeholders can understand what's involved, provides a roadmap for assigning tasks, scheduling work, and budgeting, helps focus team members on common objectives, and prevents projects from expanding beyond the established vision. It's expected that a project will evolve along the way, so the better the project has been scoped at the beginning, including guidelines for change requests, the better the team will be able to manage necessary change. Being as specific as possible in developing a project scope helps avoid scope creep, a situation in which parts of a project ends up requiring more work, time, or effort because of poor planning or miscommunication. A well-done scope statement is considered a critical part of effective project management, and project scope should be determined for every project, regardless of project size or management methodology. What's the hardest part of defining a project scope?
Now, I hope you have a better understanding about project scope after the video. This is an example of a scope statements that you can actually refer to. Okay, there are some consideration that I've provided in this slide, like to help you to develop your scope statements. So some of the questions that you might want to think about is how broad or narrow in scope do you want your project to be? Meaning to say, how many phases do you want? How long do you want the project to be? Like, who are your target audience? Where is this so-called change going to be happening at, and what resources are needed? So these are some of the consideration you want to provide. Now, the next component you want to include in your proposal is the project schedule, which is usually presented in a Gantt chart. So a Gantt chart is actually a project planning tool that helps you to outline your project schedules with their specific tasks, how long it's going to take. So it allows the team to make realistic timelines, and then is useful for monitoring the project progress. Now, this slide shows you a simple example of a Gantt chart. Now, step 2, we will need to identify and gather feedback from the key stakeholders for the project. Now, before you begin any projects, it's important for you to identify all the key stakeholders for your project so that you can get their support, as well as to make sure that they don't give you opposition when you conduct your project. So before all this begins, you need to make sure that you brainstorm and identify all of them, and then you conduct a stakeholder analysis to determine so-called the level of communication you want to engage with them based on their influence and interest in your project. The next video will explain more about this.
When it comes to managing projects and implementing ideas, your actions can affect a lot of people, and some of them will have more influence than others. Knowing who these influential people are before you start a project or initiative is incredibly important. This is because you're more likely to succeed if you have their support. But how can you identify these key people? This is where conducting a stakeholder analysis is useful. There are 3 steps to doing this. First, you brainstorm a list of people who might have an interest in your project. They could include your boss, senior executives, colleagues, clients, shareholders, or even trade associations or people in the community. You might have a long list once you're done, and that's fine. Some of these people will have a big influence in what you're doing, while others will have none at all. In step 2, you're going to plot all of these people on a power interest grid. to get a visual representation of their influence. As you can see, it's divided into 4 quadrants. The actions you take will depend on where they are on the grid. Plot people vertically based on how powerful they are, and horizontally based on how much interest they have on your project. For example, imagine you've identified 4 people who have a stake in your project. These are your boss, Diego, your colleagues, Sarah and Addie, and a senior executive, John. Diego and John both have a great deal of power and interest in your project, so you need to place them in the upper right-hand quadrant. You'll want to work closely with both of them during implementation. Sarah and Addie, on the other hand, have a great deal of interest in your project, but little power. They'll both go in the lower right quadrant. You won't work closely with them, but you want to keep them informed of your progress. Once you've plotted all your stakeholders on the grid, you'll need to find out what motivates them. For instance, what financial or emotional interest do they have in your project? Who influences their opinions? You'll likely find that some of your stakeholders will be avid supporters of what you're doing, while others might try to block your efforts. You can refine the grid by color-coding each person's name, depending on whether you think they'll be a supporter or a critic. In our example, Diego, Addie, and Sarah support your project, while John opposes it. So you'll need to do some work to win him round.
Now, after you watch the video, this is an example of how a stakeholder analysis will look like, but please be assured that there are a lot of different ways of presenting it, so feel free to adopt any method that you are comfortable with. Following stakeholder analysis, the third step is actually to establish your project outcomes. So what is project outcomes? It's also known as project matrix, measures, or impact. Okay, so project outcomes tells us, or the team, whether the changes they are making actually leads to improvement and determine the success of the project. So it's a critical part of testing and implementing change. So how can we derive or write out project outcomes? It actually can be derived from a variety of sources such as company KPIs, research, CPGs, as well as national so-called healthcare standards, and even financial reports. So one of the ways that we can so-called develop project outcomes is to use the NHS Scotland 6 healthcare quality dimension framework. So these so-called project outcomes can be classified under patient-centeredness, safety, effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and timeliness. And alternatively, we can also use the IHI 3 types of measure domains to derive our project outcomes. So these 3 domains are process measures, outcome measures, and balancing measures. So process measures indicates whether the parts or the steps in the systems are performing as planned. It informs you whether you're on track to improve the system. So these are some examples in the slides. As for outcome measures, it indicates how the system have impacted the patients, staff, and all stakeholders. So these are some examples as shown in the slides. Now the third domain is known as balancing measures, which is used to determine if the changes that you have designed to improve the system actually cause a new problem in other parts of the systems. It sounds very complex, but a good example to give you is probably medication and its side effects. So like for example, morphine, the intended effect is actually to so-called promote pain relief, but the side effects is probably that patient will experience nausea and vomiting. So balancing measures are very important for you to help you to look at the system from different direction and dimensions. So these are some examples that I have given you in the slides to help you to understand a bit more about balancing measures.
The Run Chart video series is about the family of measures. So when to use a run chart? A run chart is used to plot the data for the family of measures. So what are the family of measures? They are outcome measures, process measures, and balancing measures. So in order to measure the overall progress of your quality improvement project, these 3 major types of measures need to be considered. So why do we need the family of measures? Because healthcare systems are incredibly complex, any single measure as a sole means of determining improvement in a particular process or system is inadequate. What we need is multiple measures. They are necessary to better evaluate the impact of changes on the many facets of the system or the process. Improvement projects typically require a family of measures of say 5 to 8 key global measures. And these measures are plotted using either a run chart or a statistical process control chart. So what is an outcome measure? An outcome measure is based on your quality improvement project's aim statement or the overall outcome that you're trying to achieve. An outcome measure is often the voice of the patient or the consumer, or it might be the stakeholders, staff, or the community. It's the overall measure on how the process or the system is performing, in other words, the end result. An example here about patient falls prevention. The outcome measures for this kind of project might be the number of patient falls per month, or the fall rate per 1,000 occupied bed days, or the number of days between patient falls. And here's an example of a run chart looking at fall rate per 1,000 occupied bed days over time. So process measures, what are they? So they're a measure of the parts or steps in a process or a system to determine how they're performing. In a quality improvement project, you'll make some changes as you want to make some improvement, and the process measures will focus on those changes to see if they're actually working. They can be measures of best practice, or they may focus on the primary and secondary drivers in your driver diagram. And you'll find that process measures can change more quickly than your outcome measures. And the process measures are logically linked to achieve an intended outcome or an aim. Using the example of the patient fall prevention project, the process measures in this project are relating to best practice, and they are also the primary drivers in the driver diagram. So they are looking at the percentage of patients who have a risk screen on admission, the percentage of at-risk patients that had a comprehensive care plan completed, the percentage of at-risk patients who have all prevention interventions appropriately undertaken, and the percentage of patients who received intentional rounding. And on the right here, we have some charts that demonstrate some of those process measures. So the last family of measures is the balancing measure. The balancing measures look at the system or the process from a different direction or a different perspective. Balancing measures focus on what happened to the system or process as we made changes and improved the outcome and process measures. We need to look to see if there are any unanticipated consequences, such as knock-on effects, and some examples of this might be decrease in staff satisfaction, or increased costs, or increased waiting times for patients. We need to see if there are any other factors influencing the outcome of our project. For example, the number or the volume of patients treated each week. In other words, how busy has our team been? Also, patient acuity, the severity of illness of our patients from week to week. So in summary, balancing measures are factors to watch out for on the side to see two things, to see if they are impacting on your project or if they are being impacted by your project. Generally, you may measure one or two balancing measures in your project. However, some projects may have no factors that require data to be collected and presented as a balancing measure. We will now look at some balancing measures in respect to our patient fall prevention project. So there may be some balancing measures from the factors impacting the project, such as patient admissions per week. In other words, how busy is the team because of the number of admissions that they're receiving each week. Or patient acuity, the severity of illness of the patients and therefore the demand on staff. So this is looking at the number of admissions per week, this chart. And then there may be some balancing measures that focus on the impact of the project, such as the impact of the project on staff satisfaction. We'll now look at a mental health quality improvement project to determine how they use the family of measures. And the project was about reducing the number of patients being placed into seclusion per month. So the outcome measures were the number of seclusions per month, and they also measured the rate of seclusions per 1,000 acute bed days. And here's an example of a run chart. This is the one where they looked at the number of seclusions per month, and the many PDSAs that they tried are stated in those annotation boxes. The process measures were around best practice, and the examples here, they looked at the percentage of times operational huddle occurred, the percentage of new staff attending orientation within a month, the staff recruitment turnaround times in days, the percentage of sensory modulation that was offered to at-risk patients. Balancing measures, they looked at mental health staff claims rates and also the duration of seclusion in hours. And here's a run chart looking at that balancing measure of the duration of seclusion over time. In this next example of the family of measures, we're going to look at how a surgical team reduced their venous thromboembolism or VTE rate. So the project was around reducing incidence of orthopaedic post-operative venous thromboembolism or VTE. The outcome measure, they looked at the percentage of post-operative orthopaedic patients that had a VTE. The process measures are around best practice, And these are looking at the percentage of patients that were screened for VTE before they had their operation. Also, the percentage of at-risk patients that received their prophylaxis, in other words, their blood thinning medication, and the percentage of patients who wore compression stockings. And the balancing measure was to look at both the number and the percent of patients who had a post-operative bleed. And to the right, we've got some of the run charts looking at some of those measures. For this VTE project, we're now going to look more closely at the different measures, the outcome, process and balancing measures. And this first chart here is a process measure, and it's looking at the percentage of elective surgery patients screened preoperatively for VTE risk. The desired direction of this chart is up. The median is around 82%. There are lots of PDSA cycles that were done in June, which has resulted in an upward trend. So they're happy with this result. This next chart for the VTE project is looking at another process measure, and it's the percentage of elective surgery patients that were at risk of VTE who received their prophylaxis, in other words, their blood thinning medication. And again, they did some PDSA cycles in June, which has ended up with them having 100% compliance in October, November and December. And they were very happy with this outcome. This next chart is the outcome measure. It looks at the percentage of VTE incidents after elective surgery in orthopaedics. As we know, they did some PDSA cycles in June, and this has resulted in a downward trend. Before the team could celebrate, they also need to look at the balancing measure. This next run chart looks at the balancing measure for the VTE project. It looks at the count or the number of incidents of post-operative bleed, because post-op bleed can be a risk of the blood thinning medication. The desired direction of this chart is down, but unfortunately, at the end of the year, there is a trend upwards with the data, and this is an undesirable outcome. And the team will need to work out how they can balance the reduction of VTE incidents, but also keep their post-operative bleed rate down. You can create a dashboard of all your family measures by copy and pasting all the charts and putting them onto one page. It's now the family measure quiz time, and we'll do 6 multiple choice questions. Question number 1, which of these categories is not a type of measure? Process, giant or balancing? Question number 2, which of these measures impact on the patient and show the end result of your improvement work? Outcome, balancing and process. And question number 3, which type of measure reflects the way your systems and processes work to deliver the outcome that you want? Balancing, process and outcome. So pause the video and reflect on these questions. So the answer to the first 3 questions in our quiz are as follows. Question number 1, which of these categories is not a type of measure, is a giant? Question number 2, which of these measures impact the patient and show the end result of your improvement work? That's an outcome measure. And question number 3, which type of measure reflects the way your systems and processes work to deliver the outcome you want? And that's a process measure. Question number 4, if you were to measure the number of falls over a 12-month period, what kind of measure would this be? The options are a balancing measure, a process measure, or an outcome measure. Question number 5, which is from an infection prevention project. If you were to measure the percentage of staff who are compliant with hand hygiene, is this a balancing measure, an outcome measure, or a process measure? And a staff compliance hand hygiene project. Now, if you were to measure the percentage of staff who are compliant with hand hygiene, in this particular project, is this a balancing measure, an outcome measure, or a process measure? So pause the video and reflect on the questions and choose your answer. So the answers to these 3 questions. Question number 4, if you were to measure the number of falls over a 12-month period, what kind of measure would this be? This is an outcome measure. Question number 5, infection prevention project. So if you were to measure the percentage of staff who are compliant with hand hygiene, this would be a process measure. And with the staff compliance hand hygiene project, if you were to measure the percentage of staff who are compliant with hand hygiene in this particular project, this would be an outcome.
Now, the 4th step is actually to confirm the availability of the resources that you need and have for the project. Now, this step is known as resource allocation or scheduling. Why is it important to include this information in the proposal? Is because that you need to determine and identify for your stakeholders and team members what are the resources you require for the various activities within the project. It also allows you to monitor the so-called resources and workload throughout the project lifecycle and reassigns them as necessary. It's important for you to know that the resource allocation can be presented in a table format or within the Gantt chart itself. Step 5. Project Charter Finalization and Approval. Now, after you have finalized the project, you need to get it endorsed by someone external to the project and has the authority to grant approval for your project. This person will also be key to providing you the resources and support needed for the entire project lifecycle. Now, after you have obtained approval for your project, you can then start to form your team. The last component you need to put in your project proposal will be a list of project team members with an outline of their roles and responsibility. You need to justify why you include these people in your project because of their unique, distinct roles, responsibility and expertise. These are the crucial members that you need to include for your project. The first one is the project sponsor, which is usually a senior leaders who can provide you guidance and makes key decisions. The next person is actually the project management, who is ultimately responsible for the overall execution of the project as well as leading the team members. The third so-called members of the project will be the project team leaders. So you need to identify their contributions, and you may need to make sure that their contributions are justified based on their expertise, multidisciplinary roles, as well as the areas of the project that they can contribute to. And finally, don't forget to put in your project stakeholders, anyone who is impacted by so-called your project. This is also called a pictorial diagram about how a so-called project teams will look like and interact with each other. These are the summary points for today's lesson. We have gone through the 6 steps about how to develop your project proposal or charter.